Greetings, everyone. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Welcome to this online edition of our Books in Print Talks, an ongoing series hosted by the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Books in Print Talks are presented by UO faculty authors whose recently published books were supported by an Oregon Humanities Center Research Fellowship and/or an Oregon Humanities Center subvention grant to help cover publication costs. If you have questions for our presenter at the end of the talk, please use the chat feature of Zoom. You can access that feature by hovering over the bottom of the Zoom window with your cursor. I will moderate the questions and I will ask them. The talk is being recorded and will be available for viewing later today on the Oregon Humanities Center's website and YouTube channel. But before I introduce today's speaker, I want to alert you to a special matching gift opportunity. Supporters can maximize the impact of their gifts to the OHC thanks to the generosity of Amanda and Alex Haugland, who have generously offered to match gifts through December 31st, 2020. You can give at ohc.uoregon.edu give, and we're putting that address into the chat. I'm delighted now to introduce our speaker, Kemi Balogun, Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Sociology at the U of L. Professor Balogun joined the faculty at the University of Oregon in 2013. Her research focuses on gender, globalization, nationalism, race and ethnicity, and migration. She has published articles in outlets such as Ethnicities and Gender and Society. She is also co-editor with colleagues Lisa Gilman, Melissa Grayboys, and Habib Idrisu of Africa Every Day, Fun, Leisure, and Expressive Culture on the Continent, published by Ohio University Press in 2019. The publication of that volume was supported by an OHC subvention grant. Professor Balogun will speak to us today about her new monograph, Beauty Diplomacy, Embodying an Emerging Nation, published this year by Stanford University Press in their Globalization in Everyday Life series. Beauty Diplomacy also received an OHC publication subvention grant to help support its publication. Welcome, Kemi. We're looking forward to hearing about beauty diplomacy.
Oh, thank you so much for having me today. And thank you, Professor Paul Pepis, for inviting me and all the folks behind the scenes at the Oregon Humanities Center that made this event happen. And I also want to acknowledge that, as was mentioned by Paul, I did receive funding from the Oregon Humanities Center, not only for this book that was really helpful in terms of the late stages of making the publication happen, but then also for the co-edited volume that I have with other colleagues at the University of Oregon. So I want to thank them for that very generous support. I also want to thank folks for coming out, not only on a Friday afternoon, but also at a time where I'm sure many are anxious about the final outcomes of the election. So hopefully this is a helpful distraction for a bit. So today I'm going to talk about my book, Beauty Diplomacy. I'm going to talk about the overarching arguments that I make in the book and kind of lay out some of my interests in the research that I did, and then also speak about kind of one core argument that I make in one of the chapters that focuses on how the contestants kind of see and position the work that they do in the context of the Nigerian beauty pageant industry. So first I want to talk a little bit about how I got interested in this topic. So I noticed when I was making trips to Nigeria that beauty pageants were really part of the urban landscape of city life in Nigeria. And I was interested in why there was an increasing interest in young, upwardly mobile women participating in these events. And so I noticed these pageants not only in expected arenas, such as promoting cosmetics. So this is an example of a beauty pageant promoting Delta soap, which is a cosmetic beauty line in Nigeria. But I also found beauty pageants being promoted to, used to promote some more kind of unexpected arenas of Nigerian life. So this is an example of Miss Tourism Nigeria, where the pageant winner is supposed to use her crown, her title, as a way of promoting the tourism industry in Nigeria. This is an example of Miss Telcom 2009, where again, the winner is supposed to use her position not only to promote herself as a role model for other youths in the country, but then also to promote the telecommunications industry in Nigeria. And pageants were also used as a way of kind of talking about political communities and promoting particular social and communal values. So this is an example of Miss ECOWAS Peace Pageant, and ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. And this pageant is touted as being a way of promoting peace in the regional bloc of West African countries. I became increasingly interested in how pageants were used to promote particular ideas about representation and about community building, and particularly in the context of nation building.
I mean, can I quickly interrupt you? We're not seeing your screen.
Oh, really? Is that something I have to do on my end? Or?
Yes, I think you do. So go to the screen sharing button at the bottom of the Zoom link. See where it says share screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, there you go. Sorry.
No problem. Should I clarify that? Okay, so these are the examples I ran through. So this is the Miss Delta soap, where again, this is used to promote cosmetics in the country, a particular cosmetics line. This is the Miss Tourism Nigeria. This is Miss Telecommunications. And this is the ECOWAS example that I pointed out. And then, as I said, I was increasingly interested in how pageants were used to promote particular ideals about community, specifically in the context of the nation and nation building. So this is an example of Miss Golden Jubilee, Nigeria, where it was celebrating Nigeria's 50 years of independence. So in all of these different examples, I was able to see the ways in which pageants were used to promote particular industries, particular cultural values, and particular understandings of Nigeria as a nation. Another kind of set of events that were my entry point into looking at pageants in Nigeria, and it's what I open up the book with, is talking about the 2001 Miss World events. So in 2001, Agbani Darego, who was the Nigerian representative to the Miss World competition, was the first Black African to win the competition. And so in winning that competition, there was a lot of excitement in the country in terms of how her win signaled this optimistic and vibrant prospect of Nigeria's future. And so really upholding her and heralding her as an example of all of the kind of greatness and that Nigeria holds in terms of being able to win and capture this title, and also being the very first Black African to achieve that feat. During that time period, particular politicians signaled the importance of Agbani Darego's win by saying, for example, this was the then president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, said, "This young and gifted lady symbolizes the new Nigeria and a democratic dividend. Her victory has now opened doors to our youths to compete with the best in the world." Another politician said that her win signaled a shift from, quote, "the dark days of military rule and Nigeria being the #1 haven for corruption and bad governance to now being the #1 country in beauty and intellect." And another person said, quote, "Darego has become the greatest ambassador of Nigeria and of the continent. Darego will have access to areas that even diplomats may not be able to reach." And so in these quotes, they symbolize the symbolic significance of this beauty pageant win and all of the investments that these political elites were making on her winning this pageant. They saw it as a way of kind of announcing this new moment of democracy, given that Nigeria had just transitioned to a democratic government in 1999. It was previously a military rule and has had shifting kind of civilian and military rule since independence in 1960. And they also saw her win as kind of a direct reversal of the image that Nigeria has in the world. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with kind of stereotypes and images of kind of Nigerian scams through internet, email scams, a lot of media depictions of Nigeria as being kind of mired in political chaos and conflict. And so there was really a lot of excitement about her win in terms of showing all the kind of positivity of Nigeria as a country. Leveraging that win, the following year, those that were kind of part of organizing the competition that crowned Agbani Darego, that then went on to win the Miss World pageant, were kind of interested in harnessing that attention that Nigeria had garnered on the world stage. And so part of what they then did was the following year, they then wanted to host the 2002 Miss World in Nigeria. And what ended up happening there, and it's kind of a complex set of stories and events that I have a whole chapter of the book that I devote to. But what ended up happening there was that there was a series of protests, both within the country and outside of the country, because there were a lot of different events that happened around not wanting to host the pageant there. So one, there were groups within Nigeria who were against having Miss World in the country because they felt that it was, quote unquote, indecent, immodest, and went against Nigerian cultural and religious values. During that same time period, there was also a really prominent legal case of a woman that was sentenced to death by stoning. And so there was a boycott of having the pageant there because of all of these human rights issues and abuses. And so because of these confluence of events and protests, both within and outside of the country, the pageant was ultimately moved outside of Nigeria to London. And so some of the things that people were saying during that time period as a result of the pageant being moved, you see this kind of initial optimism around having this event that was, touted as the most lavish, the most spectacular production that's ever been undertaken. It's second only to the Olympics for international participation. And really this investment that, someone had told me that, quote, the reason that we want to have this event here is because we want to make history in Nigeria and about Nigeria. You remember Agbani was the only Nigerian and Black African to win this Miss World contest. It's prestigious. Then the idea of why can't Nigeria host it came, and the emotions of Agbani's success set in. So again, thinking about all of the optimism around hosting this major international event that was about not only promoting beauty, but hospitality and Nigeria's tourism industry, but it was ultimately, again, moved out of the country because of these different sets of protests. And one official said, quote, "We lost a great opportunity to showcase Nigeria to the world. It's one that will hurt us for a long time to come. We've got to understand the consequences of what happened. This will be with us for a long time." So thinking again about how these events are invested with all of these promises of image management, of promoting this positive image of Nigeria as a country, but ultimately those hopes were dashed because it had to be moved out of the country because of these protests. And so part of what I talk about in the book is that those two events that I opened the book up with speak to these kind of larger national narratives that Nigeria navigates within that are constantly in tension in the country. So one is the way in which Nigeria is positioned as an important country, not only in terms of the continent, but also in terms of the world at large. And so that points to a particular narrative around what's called like an African rising narrative. So what I mean by that is oftentimes the continent in general, but Nigeria in particular, is talked about in terms of all of the promises in terms of its development, in terms of it having an expanding middle class that has more and more access to capital and disposable income, a young population which is growing exponentially, and Nigeria in particular is has the largest population in Africa, and it also has the largest economy in Africa, and it surpassed South Africa in 2014. And so all of these kind of optimistic figures and framings around Nigeria often get talked about in terms of the hopes and the promises of its national trajectory. But that's often positioned against recognizing that there are a lot of problems within Nigeria and within the continent at large. And Nigeria is often held up as a kind of a quintessential exemplar of this. And so the 2002 events that kind of sparked a lot of the protests and the conflicts that sparked around hosting that pageant speak to a lot of the ways in which kind of this framing of perennial crisis around conflict, around not being able to manage issues of corruption and class divisions, et cetera, and ethnic and religious divisions in the country kind of speak to the larger kind of national narratives that beauty pageants themselves also navigate with them. So I use those two kind of examples as a way of framing that larger national story and showing the tensions within them. In terms of how I'm kind of thinking about beauty pageants, one way in which I think about them is as cultural symbols and practices. So thinking about other types of cultural events or cultural examples, things like food, sporting teams, parades, thinking about how those are particular ways that particular representations and understandings of national communities get both produced and disputed is one way in which I think about the importance and framing around beauty pageants. I also think about beauty pageants as being part of a larger scholarship and conversation around the intersections of gender and nation. So thinking about these symbolic ways in which the nation gets represented and constructed and debated happens in part through particular gender discourses and practices. And beauty pageants are a site where femininity in particular is heightened and projected. And so thinking about how there's particular cultural constructions around, for example, Lady Liberty being the symbol of the nation that's producing particular ideals around liberty and justice, and seeing how that's personified through discourses of femininity. And so thinking about how that provides, again, like a framework for thinking about some of these intersections that I'm interested in. Another way in which I talk about pageants in the book is recognizing the important work that they do in terms of connecting Nigerian elites to kind of people on the ground. And so I see them as these civic cultural institutions where the participants within the industry rely on connections and cultivate connections to politicians, to celebrities, to entrepreneurs and business leaders in Nigeria, but also maintaining some connections to kind of everyday Nigerians. And I'll speak to some examples that illustrate that. So one, in the pageant brochures, it's oftentimes very common in Nigerian pageants for them to include not only a picture of political leaders and whatever the host state is, but to also include like a blurb from the either the governor or some kind of political official that's not only welcoming and showing that they're approving of the pageant, but that they're also promoting particular aspects of their state. So this is an example of one of the states in Nigeria, Delta State, where the governor is promoting state tourism in the country. This is the other picture is of the then governor of Lagos State, which is again another state in Nigeria. And then oftentimes the owners also use their kind of connections with the pageants to facilitate these business and personal connections to powerful kind of elites in Nigeria. So in Nigeria, they will have these courtesy visits where they'll bring contestants to meet with politicians, to meet with elected officials. And it's a way for them, again, these owners. So this is a picture of the owner shaking a political leader in Nigeria or a traditional leader in Nigeria as a way of, again, cultivating these relationships. So again, these are the ways in which pageants connect to elite segments of Nigerian society. And then there's also this expectation that there are these culturally resonant aspects of Nigerian society that are incorporated into pageants as a way of kind of showing that they are in some ways grounded in the everyday experiences or can be recognized by everyday Nigerians. And so one of the ways in which that happens is they will oftentimes, or they almost all national pageants in Nigeria have what's called a traditional segment, where contestants have to wear attire that is tied to a specific ethnic group or a set of ethnic groups in Nigeria. So that's done through accessories, how you wear your hair, what you wear, etc. And it's, again, a way of showing that you have some kind of connection to ethnic groups in Nigeria, and it's a way that kind of shows that you're resonant with the different cultural, the diversity of cultures in Nigeria. And then the last picture, where you have the women dressed in all red with the longer headpiece, is an example of a contestant wearing beads and things that would be associated with traditional ethnic groups in Nigeria on the international stage. So this is at the Miss Universe pageant. And I include this picture in the book to show like some of the registers that that one of the pageants in particular that I studied had to contend with, in terms of both appealing to like a domestic audience, but then also what happens when some of these cultural elements are moved onto an international stage. And I pulled that picture, or I became aware of that picture in particular because I was browsing this popular Nigerian message board, and they were talking about that third picture as being problematic in terms of not being culturally relevant or resonant. And I can talk more about that in particular, but I just thought it was interesting to think about some of those different registers and how they resonate or not with kind of everyday Nigerians. Okay. So in terms of my methods, the book is based on 14 months of fieldwork, primarily done between 2009 to 2010, but I did follow-up visits between the years of 2014 to 2018. So I was able to track some of the changes that I saw in the industry. And I did in-depth interviews with over 65 different people, from contestants to owners to judges, and those staff members that work kind of behind the scenes, as well as photographers and fashion designers, et cetera. So I was able to get kind of a pretty wide range of perspectives in terms of the interviews. And then I also did ethnographic observations of 2 national pageants, and then include some archival material drawn from newspapers, photographs, documents of 2 different pageants, one the Miss World pageant, and then another pageant, the Miss Nigeria pageant, which is the first national pageant in Nigeria. Okay, so today I'll talk mostly about the data that I got from 2 national pageants, and I'll just give you a little bit of a background about them. So one is the Queen Nigeria pageant, which started in 2008. And it's a joint venture between the Nigerian Television Authority, which is the government-sponsored television network in Nigeria, which has broadcast stations in all different states in the country. And then the other pageant I studied is called The Most Beautiful Girl in Nigeria. It started in 1986, and it's sponsored by the Silverbird Group, which is a media conglomerate based in Nigeria, which also owns radio stations, a television network, some real estate holdings in terms of malls and shopping malls, and is known for hosting live events. One of the main differences between Queen Nigeria and this pageant is that the Most Beautiful Girl in Nigeria not only has national pageants, but also sends contestants to the major international pageants such as Miss World and Miss Universe. So in the book, I do talk about some of the differences between Queen Nigeria and the Most Beautiful Girl in Nigeria, but I won't go into depth, too much into depth with them now. But if folks have questions about that, I'm happy to answer. But just to kind of give you a little bit of, again, background on some of the distinctions between them. The Queen Nigeria pageant I talk about as being promoting a particular idea of what I call cultural nationalism, in terms of wanting to talk about Nigeria in terms of protecting its unique cultural heritage and really being cognizant of the ethnic diversity in Nigeria and wanting to promote unity in the country. And so one of the ways that you might see that is in the front page of the brochure. The front pages are green and white, which are Nigeria's national colors. And there's a picture of a silhouette of a beauty queen who has a green head wrap and a green sash. Again, and so trying to promote this image of national unity. The other pageant, the Most Beautiful Girl in Nigeria, I talk about in terms of cosmopolitan nationalism. So thinking about how a particular understanding of cosmopolitanism in terms of being jet setters, as being worldly, urbane, is promoted in this particular pageant. So again, I could talk more about the differences, but I'll speak more today about the similarities between the two. And so the main similarity that I found between both the Most Beautiful Girl in Nigeria and the Queen Nigeria pageant is that the contestants themselves were very much invested in this beauty diplomacy narrative. And so what I mean by that is they saw the work that they're doing as being part of promoting this positive image of the country that was staked, that the stakes were to kind of rectify this poor image of the country that they were very much kind of aware of and wanted to help turn around. And so this is a quote from one of the contestants, Penelope, who, when I asked her, why was she involved in pageants? What were her interested in it? Why was she interested in it? She said, quote, "Number one, we're telling people that here in Africa, women are also given a sense of responsibility, and pageantry has been able to say that. There's a whole lot of misconception about women in Africa, in Nigeria. Pageantry has really done well. It has been able not just to help Nigeria, but her citizens." So this was a very common type of phrasing in terms of talking about how they had a particular sense of responsibility, wanting to not only help themselves, but also to help the country and be a part of that positivity that they felt could be radiated through participating in pageants. Part of the way in which contestants did this was by building forms of aesthetic capital. So what I mean by that is they had to cultivate this, what I call this total package. So they not only had to embody particular physical attributes of beauty that were seen to be valued and rewarded in the industry, but also particular sets of internal dispositions that showed that they were connected to the public. So showing that they were responsible, that they were ambitious, that they were virtuous and moral people that were participating in these events, not because of their own self-interest, but because they were committed to doing charity work, committed to helping out their communities, was really important part of the kind of presentation of self for the contestants. In terms of kind of building these forms of aesthetic capital, I'm going to talk about three different aspects of this aesthetic capital. One, cultural capital, so like showing that they had particular knowledge in terms of etiquette, in terms of mannerisms, in terms of kind of connecting, especially in the public eye, was important in terms of cultivating the sense of capital. And they also were interested in translating that cultural capital to kind of their own livelihoods and their own prospects. So one of the kind of tensions that I became aware of in doing the research in terms of from the perspective of the contestants is that they had to kind of present themselves as not being in this for the money or the attention or the fame, but that they were really in this for, helping out others, right? And so that was a very strategic way in which they had to frame their interest. But ultimately, in order to kind of translate the work that they were doing into helping themselves, they had to show that they were, again, virtuous, that they were responsible, and then kind of capture the kind of benefits of being in those positions to then help themselves out. And so that meant that they felt that they could use their platform in terms of the attention that they would get, in terms of being able to make connections to Nigerian elites, to build social connections that were important for their own livelihoods and their own careers, and then ultimately kind of propel their economic mobility. And so that's kind of, again, one of the tensions that I saw in terms of how they balanced out their own personal aspirations with doing this beauty diplomacy work that they were very much invested in. So in terms of cultural capital, one, as I think mentioned, it was really important for beauty contestants and beauty queens in particular, so those that were title holders, to talk about all of the charity work that they were doing in the country. And this charity work was framed as helping the kind of most vulnerable segments of the Nigerian population. So kids, those that were suffering from chronic illness, the elderly, and kind of showing how they were using their positions for good. One of the ways in which they did this was by comparing the work that they did as beauty queens to the work that from other kind of similar industries, for example, modeling. So they would tell me that, models are similar in that, we're both valued in part for our bodies and for our looks, but we're not doing the same type of work that models do. We're doing much more important work for the country. And so these are a couple of quotes that illustrate some of that tension and some of that contrast that beauty queens would make. And so Nyeka, one of the beauty contestants, told me, quote, basically models they're all just hangers, and they walk and they have that blank expression on their face, and they just basically are showing clothes. They're not doing anything. They just walk, come out. That's what they do. But for pageantry is your beauty, intelligence, creativity, boldness, communication. It's about basically showcasing you and what you've got. And so part of what this kind of illustrates and what many other contestants talked about was that, models are only valued for their beauty. They're only valued as basically clothes hangers, but we're expected to do all of this additional work in terms of our intelligence, being creative, communicating well, and that is, much more valuable than the work that models are doing. And again, it was a tactic to show that the work that they were doing was important. Another example, this beauty contestant's quote, they're not talking about Nigeria when they interview some models. The models can't even speak good English. In modeling, you don't have to talk. But in pageantry, you can't escape that. You have to talk. The camera will always get you. So this idea of like speaking ability and being able to talk well, specifically in terms of communicating in English in particular ways, was also a way for them to make these distinctions and show that it wasn't just about physical beauty, but they were doing this important work about speaking up for Nigeria as a country and doing work that wasn't just about their looks. So again, one of the ways in which they were one of the connections that they were able to make between doing this work for the country and promoting a more positive image through showing how, as articulate, ambitious young women, that they were kind of this more positive public face of the country. They felt that after that through doing that work, they were able to get access to kind of the more elite segments of Nigerian society. And so oftentimes contestants would tell me that, as a beauty queen, I have this access to politicians to say, I have an office, I have a title, you have to listen to me. And oftentimes just having the title and having that office as a beauty queen gave them access that they otherwise would not have, and a voice that they felt oftentimes wouldn't be heard. And so some of the ways in which they would kind of frame this is that they had all of this access that they otherwise wouldn't have. So for example, one contestant told me, you meet a lot of better people, you have an opportunity to achieve something. If there's anything you want to do, but you don't have an opportunity, they're just going to pave the way. So this idea that participating in pageants paves the ways for their kind of larger ambitions, and that it provides them with contacts. Someone said, quote, people you don't know before, the movers and the shakers who can help you in life. I met them and they're like, oh, you're the new girl. So it's really, in Nigerian pageants, like once you're kind of in that circle, it really kind of opens up your social networks in ways that you might not be able to get access to otherwise. Another part of kind of the pageant, the Nigerian pageant industry is that, you know, as a result of kind of making these social connections and being part of these networks that you otherwise wouldn't be a part of, it kind of also opens up your marriage prospects. And so one of the most kind of memorable experiences I had was in observing the pageants was that one of the staff members, one of the pageants was kind of in the back with me, and he was, you know, watching the rehearsals for the show. And he was telling me, you know, what he told me was that, you know, I'm really scared of these girls, these contestants. And I asked him why, and he told me, you know, you'd be surprised, one of them might be the future wife of a minister, meaning like a head of a national ministry in terms of like national departments in the country. And they might just be the one to make that call to make or destroy a deal. So thinking about how, again, the contestants are not only able to make kind of connections in terms of their own public work or charity work that they're doing, but they're also kind of launched into social circles that they were not previously part of. And then ultimately, their hope is to translate these forms of social capital into their own mobility prospects in terms of their own access to economic capital. And so one of the ways in which that was most visible to me was the way in which kind of access to particular forms of kind of newer, more elite lifestyles were promoted. And so in particular, the car as the status symbol was really kind of emphasized in the pageant world. And so in Nigeria, almost all pageants award their winner a car. And I learned that the car was not only just a symbol of like logistics of being able to have your own car. And oftentimes this was the first car that contestants ever had. They're usually between the ages of 18 to 26. And so it not only represented like logistical, being able to kind of logistically get around the city, but it also represented this huge status symbol of having your own car. Oftentimes especially the most beautiful girl in Nigeria provided them with a chauffeur. It's a branded car where, you know, it's very noticeable that this is a beauty queen because it's branded who's in the car. And so thinking about how that was a particular symbol of propelling their economic futures and how they were kind of invested in that narrative as well. But I also want to recognize some of the constraints that contestants also talk to me about. And so they would say that as a result of participating in the pageant, there were all of these economic expectations that were then put on them. So for example, friends, extended family members calling them repeatedly, asking for money, because the expectation is that because you're associated with the pageant, because we saw you on TV, because we saw you that, you know, on this newspaper article talking like you were connected to so-and-so, that means you have money. And how that was really, in many cases, very nerve-wracking for them, because they were then expected to kind of help out extended family members. And that oftentimes the kind of rosy picture that was painted in the public media in terms of them knowing all of these people didn't always necessarily translate into financial gain. And so thinking about some of that as a constraint. And then also thinking about the heightened public scrutiny. So these are contestants that are oftentimes talked about in social media, in gossip rags, on TV. And so feeling that kind of scrutiny and kind of the spotlight on them was another kind of constraint that was communicated to me in terms of, again, being a sense, being problematic in some ways. And then also dealing with just the industry itself in terms of kind of the promise of pageants as being this arena of, making all your dreams come true, which is a tagline that one of the contests use, to actually realizing that, not all that glitters is gold, and dealing with some of those kind of dashed promises and hopes that are prominent in that industry. So kind of acknowledging some of those constraints. But in the end, I was surprised that a lot of them talked about their participation in pageants as a source of empowerment for them. And so one contestant who talked to me about like all of this pressure that she felt under, and how at the end of kind of her experience with the pageants, she felt some kind of wariness at the end. But she talked about how kind of at the end of it all, despite some of her reservations, she did feel a sense of empowerment. So she said, quote, "First of all, it was a competition with probably thousands of girls across the nation. You feel, wow, that is another massive step. It puts you in your mind like, I can do this. In the course of it, you get a lot of girls telling you how much they want to be like you, how much you inspire them. You can actually have a voice. So it's empowering as a woman in Nigeria." So this idea of like having a voice and having a platform and having an ability to be a role model, to be seen as aspirational, and to, again, do this work of beauty diplomacy was often narrated to me as like a source of empowerment, in a way in which they had not only found it to be empowering for themselves, but ultimately empowering for the work that they wanted to do for their communities. So I think that's, my final slide. And that, again, thanks for coming, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Thanks, Kemi. Please type your questions into the chat and I will share them with Kemi. I'll ask one. One of the tensions that you didn't mention explicitly, but which came up in one of the quotations, was the tension between a kind of national consciousness and a sense of national pride, and a sense of continental consciousness. Mm-hmm. That is, being a Nigerian beauty pageant winner and being an African woman. Can you say a little bit about the relationship between those categories in the interviews you did and in your findings?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think part of, so in my interviews, there was a lot of slippage between those categories in terms of Africa and Nigeria. And part of how I understand that slippage is in part because of the discussion of Nigeria as kind of playing a really outsized role in the continent, because it has the largest population, it has the largest economy. It's known for a lot of its kind of cultural products in terms of the Nollywood industry. So it has a very booming film industry, a growing music industry. And so some of that slippage is because there was this framing that, we are kind of the first and the best and the most important. And so talking about how we're kind of this trailblazer and this trend center for the continent was a common kind of framing and understanding in terms of, we're setting the pace for, again, bringing this kind of Africa rising narrative to the forefront. So we're going to be like the trail setters and trendsetters in this larger continental narrative.
Here's a question. What was something that really surprised you in your field work?
Yeah, one of the surprising things, so as I mentioned, there were some pretty stark differences in the two national pageants I studied, the Queen Nigeria and Most Beautiful Girl Nigeria, in terms of like their symbolic investment. So the Queen Nigeria pageant would tell me, oh, we're really about cultural heritage. We want our contestants to be modest. We want them to make sure that they're promoting all of the diversity of Nigeria in terms of religion, in terms of ethnicity, and that, you know, this is kind of an everyday girl that all Nigerian women can identify with. And that's, you know, they would point the finger at the most beautiful girl in Nigeria as being inauthentic. Whereas the most beautiful girl in Nigeria would say, you know, we're important because we're the only one that has the license to send a contestant to Miss World or Miss Universe, which are important internationally, that give us all of this international recognition that the other pageant isn't able to do, and that our contestants, you know, are worldly or jet setters, etc. And so the framings were very starkly different. But one thing that surprised me was wrapping up kind of fieldwork for one pageant and then starting up fieldwork for the other one, and seeing like a group of the same contestants that I'd seen like a couple of weeks ago for one pageant showing up at the other pageant, and recognizing that, okay, the kind of framing and the strategy of the contestants themselves, even though they recognize the symbolic difference, is not the same as the pageant owners who are invested in maintaining the symbolic difference. And so that was one surprising thing, to be like, okay, it's not as if these competitions are attracting wildly different sets of contestants. Their own motivations and aspirations are not fully aligned with the owners.
So the question that came up actually relates to the point you just made. Could you talk a little bit more about the connections and the relations between the different stakeholders in the pageants, the sponsors, the owners, and the title holders? You've begun to talk about tensions there. Could you say a little bit more about those relationships?
So I think some of the connections between them is that in terms of the owners, so part of the kind of strategy of having different pageants is that, you know, you're branding and kind of maintaining this particular kind of market edge of saying why your pageant is different. But for the owners, for example, their kind of underlying motives are oftentimes very similar. So in terms of wanting to similarly be able to leverage their ownership of pageants to be connected to the governors of so-and-so state. So that's very similar, right? And so working within that same kind of ecosystem. And then in terms of the contestants, you know, they're oftentimes having kind of wanting to pursue similar sets of kind of post-pageant careers. So wanting to, for example, go into the entertainment business world or go into the beauty industry, and being able to leverage their participation in pageants to fulfill that. So that's some kind of synergy. In terms of the judges and the sponsors, they were very, one of the key differences that I saw between the sponsors is that, so for the owners, they oftentimes want that kind of the ideal sponsors are governments, like state governments, because they hold the money and the kind of influence in Nigeria. And so part of the edge that one of the contests had was that, oh, we're associated with the state-owned television network, although that didn't necessarily translate into always getting state sponsorship, but that was one of the ways in which they kind of tried to garner those relationships, to say we are state connected, and so it should be an easier play to get state funding. But for both pageants, they're kind of the ideal sense, the sources of funding were either multinational corporations or state funding, because they felt they had the most money. But in terms of being able to always consistently get that, it didn't play out the same way in both of those contests.
So Emily Duru is asking, you've talked a lot about how the pageants place an importance on cultural heritage and representation for people in both cities and villages. Emily wants to know, how accessible are these pageants for everyday people?
Yeah, so that's another major contradiction, in that they're fairly accessible if you live in urban cities, in that, they're kind of part of, you'll see them on TV, they'll be advertised, and so they're recognized, especially also kind of depending on your class status as well. But there's a big kind of distinction between kind of urban rural divides in terms of kind of your access and even just awareness of these pageants. So I think that's an important distinction. So oftentimes they're framed as, this is pageants are something that anyone can participate in, but the reality is in Nigeria, you have to pay, at the time it was like a $30 fee to even enter, and then have access to all of the different kind of financial resources to be successful. So having money to pay for shoes and gowns and makeup, accessories, etc. But the kind of play was that this was presumably open. Another kind of interesting framing that I saw was oftentimes the contestants themselves, especially in the Most Beautiful Girl in Nigeria, were seen to come from like rural village backgrounds, even though that was not the case when I actually talked to the contestants. They were mostly from like working class, middle class backgrounds. And so, and they, almost all of them grew up in cities. And so the framing around, seeing that, oh, these contestants come from villages or very poor backgrounds, was a way for the owners to say that, oh, they're kind of the way in which they get catapulted into the public spotlight and have all of this new access to elite social circles and more access to money is because of us. And so it's a way for them to get kind of the credit for that. Even though the kind of backgrounds of the contestants themselves were, again, not very few, were from very, like from village or rural backgrounds. And so, yeah, that's how I would answer that question.
Are the people who spectate from a broad, range of social positions?
So in terms of I saw a difference between the Queen Nigeria, especially the year that I observed, and the Most Beautiful Girl Nigeria in terms of the live audience, because part of that has to do with the fee they had to pay to get in. So the Queen Nigeria fee was a lot lower. It would be like what you would spend to go to like a movie or something. But again, that's not accessible to everyone, but it was more accessible than the Most Beautiful Girl in Nigeria, where they were selling tickets upwards of like $200, $300 for like, and they had different kind of VIP statuses. So yeah, so in terms of the live audience, they're very different. They are both broadcast on kind of broadcast television. So if you have an antenna, you could watch both of them. But, in terms of the live audience, there is a pure fee you have to pay.
So the next question is from our colleague, Kristen Yaris, who asks, she states first, women in the beauty industry in Latin America, for example, in Argentina, have been on the front lines of the global movement around Time's Up, for instance, bringing attention to sexual assault and gender inequality in these industries and society more broadly. Have the women you worked with in Nigeria similarly become politically involved in these global movements for gender equity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things I noticed, especially in the course of doing like follow-up interviews in 2018, where the Me Too movement was really kind of at the public forefront, or more so than when I started the research, was that contestants were a lot more frank with me about having to navigate dealing with issues of like sexual harassment in the industry. And so one of the things that is important to note is that, especially in the pageants that I studied, the owners and kind of the figureheads were male, and the contestants were all female. And so navigating some of those gendered issues around power also became important. And they would tell me that this is part of the reasons why they felt constrained and frustrated in terms of navigating some of those pitfalls. in terms of like the industry more broadly, not necessarily these, the pageants that I studied. So one of the things that I think is important is like how they framed gender empowerment. So they would talk about how their work as being role models and being like appreciated and given a voice was a way for them to kind of signal and pay attention to the importance of women. But I also found that this kind of empowerment story was very much like co-opted in by multiple people in the industry. So kind of recognizing the way in which like that language can be used as a way of not really advancing change, but used as a way of kind of perpetuating a social structure that's already in place was something that I very like. I noticed that, you know, the owners would talk about, you know, we are empowering women by having these events, you know, and so you know, I haven't seen as much in terms of like necessarily being at the kind of for like current contestants to be kind of at the forefront, but kind of more, you know, past contestants or previous contestants making these kind of more bolder statements is something I've seen more of.
You mentioned the story about the staff member who was worried about the future and that he might get fired, or because one of these women could marry a political elite leader. Have you followed up with any of the pageant winners subsequently to find out where they wound up and what they've, you know, what their situation was in retrospect, looking back on the impact that it had had on them?
Yeah, I was able to follow up with some of them, and I found that they either kind of went a number of routes. So either they were in the entertainment industry working as actresses, or working as like television hosts, presenters, or they were in kind of the beauty industry, so like having their own salons or selling shoes and accessories, or they were kind of in the professional world. So a couple of people are working as bankers, as doctors, you know, and then some kind of really purposely want to stay in the spotlight, and then some very much don't, like they very much want to retreat from kind of public life. But that kind of narrative of using pageants or being a part of pageants as a way of kind of, you know, marrying up, it was a common narrative. And some, you know, people are not upfront like necessarily upfront with that, but some did kind of succeed in that sense.
So the next question's from Kiana Nardoza, who asks, is there proof that these pageants directly generate capital in terms of tourism and travel? If so, is this regional or international? Wondering about the impact of the Most Beautiful Girl in Nigeria and how it is on the international stage. What happens to the pageant participants internationally?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So in terms of what happens internationally, I think that there's a bigger case for how kind of the lives of individual contestants might benefit economically. So for example, Agbani Darego, who I talked about as being the first Black African to win Miss World, and how, you know, she kind of got these modeling contracts. She hosted a bunch of different reality shows in Nigeria. She now has a clothing line. And so I think I could definitely make the case for how kind of her own kind of as an individual, she has succeeded. I think that the case made for like the economic benefits in terms of like a national benefit is kind of similar to the argument that's made about the Olympics, and that, you know, you have all of this kind of financial capital investment, but oftentimes that it's not fully realized in terms of the full benefit, in terms of the tourism benefit or reaping all of the financial capital and investment. And I think what's difficult in terms of Nigeria is because, you know, what would be great is if they actually hosted the 2002 Miss World, and I can kind of track to see what happened after. But since they didn't end up fully hosting it, they ended up actually losing a lot of money because they didn't, that event didn't hold. But I think that a lot of the expectation is that, this not only generates financial capital in terms of investment, but also generates all of these tourism dollars because we're able to promote an image that has this more like positive reputation on the country that in theory should translate into economic capital. But I can't make the exact case in terms of Nigeria because what would have been the best example, ended up not panning out.
A question from Jalen Thompson, who asks, could you talk more about the role of television production and other media in the pageants? Do contestants have to stay in the public eye in order to maintain their image?
It's a good question. So the cycle of a pageant runs, within a year. So in terms of those that are like crowned winners, you have kind of that year to maximize your, platform, to maximize that attention that you have. And so, there were some contestants that were able to do a much better job than that in terms of making sure they were appearing on all the television breakfast shows and entertainment shows that would kind of again maximize that spotlight. But like once the next cycle turns over, the attention is kind of casted on the next kind of crop of beauty queens. And so part of that process, people would tell me, is that you need to see this as not like your end game, but like your stepping stone. So use as much of this attention as you have to lay the groundwork for what you're going to do after this, and making sure that you have a clear foundation for your kind of post-pageant life, because pageants are not a career, it's a stepping stone is often how it would be framed to me. So recognizing that you can kind of translate that initial success into something much larger, possibly, but it's not guaranteed.
So we've come to just after 1 o'clock, and we've also come to the end of the questions in the chat. So Kemi, let me thank you again for sharing this fascinating work with us, and for your insights and the interest of the topic. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us for Kemi Balogun's book talk on beauty diplomacy, embodying an emerging nation. For more information about Oregon Humanities Center and our upcoming sponsored events, or if you'd like to contribute to supporting our research and public programs, go to ohc.uoregon.edu, and we'll see you next time.